All right, one of the questions that I just saw on the Yahoo Groups discussion forum for Dog Waffle was on how to create a brick wall, and not just any brick wall, but sort of a realistic brick wall. Now there are a couple of ways to get started on that, and there is, for instance, a brick texture that we can render, and to get started with that, that's obviously not a very realistic one, but it's a starting point. And one thing I wanted to do in this tutorial is just explore some of the possibilities with that. Now, if you adjust the size of the brick and the mortar relative to the brick, one thing you may want to do is see if you get to a point where you have a continuity at the top and the bottom, and also left to right, some sort of something that could be used for a seamless texture replication. It's not doing that by default. You can find occasionally some settings that will look fairly well suited for that. Actually, this one is a good one, where we don't have at the top the white mortar, but we have it at the bottom nearby, and then it turns back into the mortar at the brick part. So this might actually tile quite nicely vertically, and horizontally too. It might be a little bit off, you know, maybe some of the bricks might be a little bit longer. Like this one here on the left, you see has a pretty significant chunk. If we add it to the one here on the right, it will make it probably a little bit longer than the other siblings here, the other textures. But that's still a possible way to get started. And what I would do is store this when you have a starting point for some sort of a basic layout of this texture. Store a copy of that, because you may want to get back to that and use it a few more times. So a couple of ways you can make this perhaps look a little bit more realistic. One of them, actually just applying sort of a shading effect to that, is under the Stylize lighting tool. And so sometimes that is enough for what you need, right? Sometimes you just want a little bit of a light source added to that, maybe a little bit brighter, maybe a little bit closer down to it. And then also, if you look at the length of the shading here, the shadows, you can adjust the texture height to give it a bit more of that 3D plastic or 3D depth look to it. You can adjust the coloring, multiplying with the original. And then there's also the smoothness that can add a bit of drama to that. But let's say we keep it at that. We add a little bit of gloss or specular highlight to that, not too much. And you have this. So there's one way to apply a bit of a shading or 3D lighting to that. There's obviously also other levels of colors of the light source you can apply. The light intensity here can be reduced to give it a bit more mood. Perhaps you can add another. And actually, when you do that, keep an eye on what's happening on the right side here. I'm currently looking at just one layer, but if I add a light, there's a second layer that's added and selected. So I'm now working on layer 1, and I can set the light color to be quite different, something like a bluish or maybe purplish color, and then move that one down, so I can give it an additional lighting effect here. Perhaps bring it back a little bit farther. So all sorts of slight variations to the lighting that you could get from that. So here is an example. I can flatten this all down. I can still actually, this layer, before I do that, I can adjust this layer, which is in additive mode for the second light source. I can adjust it to perhaps be more dominant or less dominant, and then flatten it down, flatten the image. And so that's obviously already more realistic than what we had before. Let me store this one here as one milestone. This is the initial image. This is another one. Now, going back to this image, we could actually do quite a bit more on the texture that we apply to that. So one thing you could do is select the bright parts, like what should become mortar, right? Select by color key or the lights. If you select the light part, that probably will select it here. You can see the marching ants. It depends a bit on the size at which you look at it. If there's too many of those, you may want to reduce the number, or actually just hide the marching ants. And if you need to check if it's actually selected another way other than the marching ants, is you could use the overlay alpha. And what turns purplish is the non-selected part. So since the white part is not turning purplish, that one is still fully selected. One thing you can also do is store the alpha to get an idea of what actually has been selected, and see it here. So the white part is the selected part. The thing is, it's not totally black on the purple side here, and that's indicating that it got somewhat selected, right? It's not an on or off selection. It's not just a single bit. It's an 8-bit value, and you might want to perhaps adjust that selection to make it more all or nothing, right? So something like adjust alpha, and you actually will see it in the black and white mode here. So you could increase the contrast to say if it's not selected, fully selected, that is, like the dark parts here on the brick, just don't select it at all. Bring it down to fully black, and you can adjust it either by value and brightness, or all of the above here. And in the end, you should have really just a very bright white for the selected part, the mortar, and fully black on the bricks that are not selected. So when you do that, you have a selection that I would recommend storing here, because you'll probably go back to that on occasion here. So let's store the alpha and have sort of a snapshot that way. You can invert it right here and put that in. So now we have actually the brick showing at their color, and the white part is turning purplish, indicating that with the overlay alpha enabled here, indicating that it's not selected. All right, so let's see, how do we now apply that texture to the brick, right? So for instance, one thing you can do, let's work on the brick, or let's invert it and work on the mortar. Either way, whatever is selected, we can apply some texture to it, for instance, by using the fill tool, with the fill settings first set in such a way that it applies, that it contains a paper texture. That is actually something you can also do directly here with the fill. Adjustable paint fill might just work as well. Let's have a look at that one. So there's this one, the adjustable one, actually lets you do a little bit of a directional choosing here, and that will apply some sort of texturing to that. Not necessarily my favorite, so I'm going to go and undo that and take a look at the paper texture. You see, you can enable the paper texture, and for instance, if you were to paint over it, it would apply that paper texture. So what does that paper texture actually look like? Well, when you have the brush enabled, you can see papers right here. It's probably something you can also pull down here under the fill tool, fill settings. There will be some options for additional controls with the textures, and there are the patterns, and that actually is a another way that you can use the there it is, use it as a brush or use it as paper texture. So if you need it, in fact, there's a brick wall texture right there. You could have just plastered that right into a white plain surface, and it would have probably done a pretty good job as well. But let's say we wanted to have something that looks a little bit like mortar, or rather the brick textures, or brushed, maybe something like this. It's certainly a texture that you might actually have your own already. Let's take maybe sand, stone wall. Some of these might look interesting too. Let's take the stone wall. All right, so what if we actually plaster that with the fill tool? So we need to make sure that we have not just the texture selected here that we did, but if we actually say we want a pattern fill, we want to make sure that that actually gets used. But right now it's in paper texture mode, right? So it's not going to fill it. It's just going to apply this as a paper texture if, for instance, we brush with a paintbrush. So let's go with something like a simple or a large airbrush there, something like this, and make sure the paper texture is enabled. Get this little triangle here. So as you're painting over that, you'll see that it's applying the texture, but it's also applying black. That's not good. It's turning it dark. Undo that and see if we, with the right button there, that's better. Now it's applying the texture, the paper part of the texture. Now, how can we adjust the size or the intensity of that? That's another way to do it. you could go to the papers right there and actually see all the settings for that. In fact, look at that. There's some presets for different types of paper textures already. So rather than picking them up from other places, you could actually pick them right there and adjust the bumpiness, the relief. You can have also the scale of it, so you can make it a little bit smaller. So now it's, oh, left button is what I need to use. Now it's a little bit smaller. Let's go even smaller. So you see the paper texture starting to fill in on that. Maybe dry brush. There's a variety of ways to adjust that, and maybe we could actually use some of the other papers like this one here and give it a little bit of variety that way, right? So you don't have it all look exactly the same. Let's take this one, and you see that one has a bit more of a slanted look, so it looks like a little bit at an angle. That actually would be one that we should probably use for the bricks, not so much for the mortar. So let me go back to the bumpy ones. There you go. And you could actually just apply the fill tool now with that. So let's go erase the selection. Right click here and say clear the selected to white. So the bricks go back, the mortar goes back to plain white. And now I'm simply going to use my fill tool, which is still on pattern fill mode, right? But with that paper texture here. And I'm going to give it some sort of a fill command right there. Okay, and well, that one's dark, so that's not exactly what I needed. Well, we could invert it. We could invert the image here. Invert, there you go. Now that inverted the other side too, the breaks. We'll work on that later. But so we have some bright patterns there, and or you know what? If we didn't want to invert the breaks, we can actually invert it through the filter. Let's do it the right way here. So that would be probably under adjust. Let's see, adjust or maybe color. There's usually there, invert value. There, that one does that through the alpha channel. So the selection is making sure it's only applying that inversion through that particular part. And by the way, if you don't want it that bright, you can still do the interactive undo here, right? And adjust a little bit. This is before and this is after. Go somewhere in between, right? If you want a kind of a grayish tone like this. Anyway, so we got some bumpiness to that mortar. Now let's work on the bricks, and so we'll select this striped approach here on the paper texture, and then we'll invert the selection and replace it. There you go. So now we are working on the bricks, which are kind of a orange reddish tint initially. So let's go and reduce the size a little bit here and see if we paint on it, what that does for us. Yeah, we have some paper texture appearing, and of course we want to perhaps not force it to white. We want to keep it reddish. So that would actually be better done by looking at the patterns. If we have something that we can use directly from there that's already colorized, or we work on our brush settings to make sure we don't damage. We actually give it the color. So let's see the paper textures here. Here we have the paper texture. We see the paper is still the one we have. Let's see actually which one is it. Let's make sure we use this one here, the slightly angle look to it, and then select the brush settings. Let's pin this one down. Right, so we can actually have the papers when we need it, and the brush settings remain visible. So what I want to do is, since I'm using this custom brush, that's a relatively large, what was it here, Airbrush 100, that's a custom brush, so I can actually use the custom tab here to adjust some of the things. And by default right now it's a matte brush, so it's using it as a matte. If I use the color, it will possibly change the behavior as actually applying the color that it has in that image. I'd rather just have the paper texture show, but I also want the color to kind of turn a reddish tint. So I probably need to just simply pick it up. No, that's not quite yet. So there you go. Now I have it. So I have sort of a reddish tint, maybe a little bit more, something like this. Really strong coloring onto the reddish side. There you go. So now I get my reddish appearance on those breaks, but that texture is obviously way too strong. I mean, that paper texture is probably not as that's not going to look too good. So one thing I want to do is reduce the relief here, so it's only a little bit showing me that bumpiness to it, right? The scale, I could make it smaller, I could make it a little bit bigger on the paper. So there we go, we got a little bit of that bumpiness to it and that relief look. And once again, I can either paint it all over like this, and that'll be done pretty quickly, or I can apply that with the fill tool. So let me do and undo that a few times until I think I have it all gone. There you go. Oh, that's one too many. Okay, so now I have the selection here on the bricks, and I'm going to use the fill tool, image, fill, like this. And yeah, that one of course is not using the paint. So I might actually prefer to use the other mode, just painting it on this one. So well, let's try one more time here. So many parameters that interact with each other. Paint fill is another one. That one actually is not doing it for me. So let's say paint regular fill. Yeah, no, see that one is changing the color as well. So I might want to do, well, maybe this will do it. No, it's the pattern that I need. Well, I think so. Anyway, let's try one last one here. Ah, yeah, of course, that's the one. It's a plain color fill, but with the paper texture on it, right? That's why it is that way. So if I didn't have the paper texture enabled, if I uncheck this, the paper texture exists, but it's not currently enabled. So I think when I fill this here, yep, there's just a plain color fill, right? Whereas if I do enable the paper texture, and the paper texture is right here, maybe not too much, maybe a little bit smaller. There you go, set those settings, then I can apply the fill and the paper texture goes into that brick. Now it's a very clean transition here, and you might want to also worry about that a little bit, and how do I adjust it so there's a little bit of noise along those edges. One thing that you could do is just add a little bit of softness to that selection mask, blur it, basically go to the file, to the selection menu and do a Gaussian or a box filter alpha, show it as an alpha here so you can see how much of that blurring is actually happening. Just a few pixels, don't give it too much, just 1 or 2 is probably just enough here. And then let's give it 2 just to exaggerate a little bit. There you go. And so now what I'll do is I'll jitter it. I'll add some jitter filter under the noise. There's a jitter or jitter blur plus. And with that, you get to jitter the whole thing a little bit, so that some of the pixels from the neighboring areas are starting to bleed in as well. Let's try the jitter blur plus here. Noise jitter blur plus. Probably too strong. Excuse me. Yeah, it's pulling some colors from the back there to scatter RGB separately, HSV. There's a couple of different ways to scatter this thing. Some of them take significantly longer, so be prepared to wait a second or two. I don't think I want those separately, so I'm going to go RGB, all scattering the pixels, and maximum samples, minimum amount, just a little bit here is all we need. There you go. So that gives us a little bit of noise. Perhaps actually another way is to not do the noise like this, just value noise might do it, or color noise. Do a combination of those, voice noise removal. Let's see, for instance, in the value noise, right? That will add a little bit of bumpiness. We already have some bumpiness on the brick itself, but it will add some along the edges too. So, a combination of those probably will allow you to do a little bit of jitter, a little bit of noise, a little bit of smoothing, even just smoothing it, even just smoothing or blurring. Like do a little Gaussian blur on that. Will not do it just inside the area, but also to the edge now, since we have loosened the what is it? We've made a little bit of a blur on the selection itself as well. So as such, we should be able to get a little bit of a transitional effect there, right? Not too much. We just want just a tiny little bit. What I think my favorite is going to be something with the noise on the jitter. Let's try that one last time. Just not too much, just a little bit. There you go. Okay, so that way it will have a little bit of sort of a tendency to blend things together along the edges and make it a very noisy brick, a very a brick that doesn't seem to have a very clean cut there. We might also want to clear the alpha and actually let's do clear alpha here and do a little bit of blur now all over, right? So that's another one here, blur, simple blur perhaps. Don't do too much of it though. But you could side by side it here. You could apply it on one side. Of course, you have to be on the middle of that image to really recognize that transition. So let's close this. Let's go to filter, blur, box filter, simple. Any of these will do a fairly decent job at blurring it just a little bit. Side by side, left side is left untouched, right side is blurred, so you can see if is it too much or is it just about right. And then when you apply it, when you OK, it applies it all over the image. Alright, so we have now a texture, an image that has a bit more content because it also has that bumpiness to it. And sure enough, if we go and store that and then we'll take it into the same tool we had earlier, which is the stylized lighting tool, there's going to be a bit more of oh, we got another order here. Nice. We've got real-time behavior here. We have a little bit of a bumpiness to that texture now, right? And we can perhaps reduce it if it's too much. Add a bit more of the original color. So there it is. Now, but that's still not what I would call a realistic. That's still not what I call a realistic texture, and the reason really is that well, it doesn't. It's flat on. Now, if that's all you're looking for, you know, that's fine. But how about we add a bit of perspective, 3D-ish to that? So let me go back. Let me store this one just for keep it as one more we've done. So let's go back to this one and see if we can actually use another filter. There is a transform 3D perspective. That one will not apply lighting, but it applies a perspective skew or distortion to that. So now sometimes that's what you're looking for, right? There's something like a wall that goes to infinity. Now it's kind of noisy back there, and we may want to blur it to make it disappear into white or dark. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go minimize that. Probably don't need this anymore. What we could do is use the filter. Oh no, rather the tool here, this one here. Right click on that and use the linear gradient tool. Right now, your gradient that you currently use may be just a black to white, and we don't want to do that. We want to modify the current image, right? This one here, so that we leave it untouched in the front, but just around here is where we want to start blending into white. So one way we could do that is change the mode. The mode right now is a replace mode. Right? But if we make it additive, the black part will not add anything because black is 0, nothing changes. So the color is going to stay unchanged. But the moment I go into white over here, that's when we can actually have it disappear into white. So that's a quick way to make it go into a different transition into a different color. I could go perhaps even earlier here like this. Just want to make sure I'm at 100% already by the time I reach that horizon over there. Right? So here's a quick way to make it fade into white. We could also then try some other things like, oh, what's that new one here? The color, the local contrast. Do a little bit of dynamic HDR type simulation and get a little bit more. Or something like, what's the other? There's a nice photographic filter, the soft contrast improvement. Sometimes that one actually will be very useful. Play with that a little bit. Another one that you might also want to do at that point is perhaps sharpen it around here again. So go back to sharpen, digital photo enhance. That one is a good one to use as well. There's a lot of different outer ways to make this brick look more realistic, and one, of course, then at that point, you may want to actually, combine the lighting effects and the perspective and add some shadows cast. Well, now we're talking 3D. All right, so now we're talking add actually the bumpiness to the swap buffer. Let's add it to store this as a. Actually, let's do the coloring. So turn it to grayscale. So the only thing what we're focusing on right now is the bumpiness that we have on it. So let's make this a bump map that we will keep, in fact, in the swap image. So let's copy that to the swap image, and then we bring back. Oh wait, I swapped it. That's not what I want. Let's go back. Let's copy it to the swap image. There, copy to swap image. And then I bring this one back. That's the colors that I want. And the two, of course, I can see them both together, combined in a multiply way or screen mode. There's a couple of different ways, 20 or so different levels of combining. But what I really want to do now is turn this into 3D. All right, so let's keep the coloring on the main image. Let's keep the bump map on the back image here, on the swap image, and then at that point you can go to two different ways to render that 3D. One is under the transform, both of them. One is the 3D designer, and then the other one is PuppyRay. And let's talk about both of these ways. Right, so the 3D designer has a couple of interesting new features. You could add some erosion to that. You can do all sorts of things, but let's keep it simple and perhaps focus on what does it do initially with that. So you have the bricks here. You can adjust how much of displacement you get from that. In fact, you can, maybe you want to see it from the back end like this. There you go. So that that image is used to turn it into an elevation map. You can also change the scale here. But one thing you notice, it's not being tiled. The brick is not endless. That's the thing we can do with PuppyRay, however. But there are other things that are great. We can use the color from the object or from the image in the back, so that's already a little bit closer to what we probably are looking for. There you go. There's a little bit of an adjustment we can get. And then it's a matter of working with the lighting here to see if we can get some even better looking appearance on that. Adjust the camera zoom. You have probably an idea of what it is you want in terms of the orientation of all this. Do you want to look down the wall? Do you want to look sideways at it? Right. Let's say, for instance, you want to have it something like this. Move back a little bit. Take the Z angle here, the Z movement. Move it to the right. Scale it perhaps. There you go. Stretch it a little bit more. Stretch it down. There you go. So that starts giving you a nice, interesting brick wall. And let's say again we want that brick wall to go sideways, disappear. Maybe a little bit more of perspective would be useful here. Let's move it down. Let's move back a little bit. So we get very close to the edge. You see here on the left side I have the edge showing. And so we can adjust this and then work with the lights. We have two lights on this one. We have one light here that's kind of a bluish tint. And then we have a light at the top here that's got the reddish tint. And so let's adjust the brightness. That's the light range. And you see that it does the lighting, but it can even cast some rays, shadows. So let's exaggerate the amplitude a little bit so we can see the lighting better. And in fact, I'm going to reduce the intensity of the second light range just so we see only this one. What I'm going to do with this one is have the altitude relatively low, so it's coming close to the wall, right, like this. But I'm going to have it at a far away zenith, so I need to increase the light range, the intensity to still see it. But now we have some pretty low lighting, side effect lighting, and we can now enable also our ray traced here, the ray traced shadow. So we can have it soft shadows, for instance. Now that one's way too low on the altitude, so I'm going to bring it up a little bit, bring it in a little bit on the zenith. Maybe I went too far here. But we now have this light coming from the side and casting shadows. Now it's a little bit too intense. The amplitude is too big, so I'm going to bring it down a little bit. There you go. Okay, so that's one way to work. We can work from the image as the displacement. We can also work from the swap image to provide the coloring. But then, of course, it turns back to the black and white because we applied that grayscale conversion and put that in the swap image. So one thing I'd rather probably stay, if I want that reddish color, is to keep it there. So at that point, you can work with the lights. You can work, with the shadows. Keep in mind that as you adjust the parameters, for performance sake, it's going to switch to a lower resolution. You can adjust it here to keep it low, but you probably don't want to. You'll probably want to keep the image at the highest possible resolution. And so there is also the fog. You could have it disappear into distance there, the fog. That's the distant fog. Let's say we want the color to be actually white. So you just change the secondary, that dark color here, black background color. You change that so the fog at a distance is white. It varies with that camera zoom as well. So let's do that. Let's adjust it vertically on the size. Let's move it a little bit to the left so we don't see that edge. So we're getting there. We can adjust the shadows. Let's bring it lower. Let's bring this altitude a little bit lower so we got a good amount of shadows. And now it's time to add some fill lights. This one here we'll have at 0 zenith, but also very high altitude, so it's kind of above the scene, above it all, and this won't make much rotation to it anymore. We can adjust the lighting a little bit here, and so that way we get a bit more of that bumpiness to it, and still have some shading. We can improve some more. We can add some ambient occlusion too. That one actually will probably add a good amount of realism to it. So let's say we want to add a little bit of the lighting in general. There you go. Alright, so the final render might look like this. We'll add some anti-aliasing. This will take a little while if we put it at level 5. So I'm going to give it level 3. Keep more detail, so pre-filter, reduce the pre-filter, or make it more soft, a little bit more. Adjust your final displacement here if you don't want those bricks to come out too much. It's actually a bit saturated here. You barely see any of the bumpiness. Probably too much lighting, too harsh lighting, right? Too harsh on it. So you might want to reduce or maybe add a little bit of fog in a different level. This is the ground fog, so you can do a non-linear ground fog here and add some whiteness to that as well. So lots of little fine-tuning controls. Let's reduce the brightness of the light number 1 so we get to see a little bit of the bumpiness there, something like that, right? And let's go and render that again. We can probably go to something in between here to keep a little bit of the bumpiness there. Let's go render that. So that's the final render now using the 3D Designer. And it's very interactive, very fast. It's on the GPU for the most part. There's a couple of other things we could do, like add some erosion to it and so on. And of course, we might want to paint on that too, and add some lichen or moss or some other things, flowers or shrubbery that climbs up those features. That you can add with the paintbrush. Excuse me there. I'm going to store this image quick again because we might want to use it for some more examples. And notice I didn't actually render it all the way to the edge, so there's a little portion we need to clip off here or cut off eventually. We might want to increase the dynamic range. I don't think we have the darkest possible there, so let's go expand dynamic range. Yep, that gives us a little bit more contrast, and there's always more we can add to that. So that's one way to use the color and the elevation or displacement map, if you want, bump map rather, from the swap image. Now I'm going to use one more technique, which is back to this, and that's the color. Swap buffer still contains this elevation map. I'm going to invert it now. I want the bricks to really be on the lower end, and right now if this is, oh no wait, this is the color map. I need to swap these two. So back on the main buffer, on the main image. Actually no, the swap image will be this. That's the coloring I want on it. The main image is going to be this, right? This is the elevation map. And so these two images here are what the Puppy Ray is going to use: the color map and the elevation map. The elevation map is coming is in the main buffer, main image here. So what I'll do is, in fact, I'll prepare for eventually doing even an animation on that. Just a side note, I like to do that. So let's go create animation at 30 frames per second for about 5 seconds long, so 150 frames. And that will take about 400 megabytes. We should have enough memory to do that. So, but right now let's focus on that. Let's make sure we still have the image there, the coloring. Yep. So we need to invert this because the white parts right now are closer. That's an elevation map here representing. This is representing an elevation map, and the brighter it is, the higher up it is. So I really want to invert that, and I'll do that again under the color invert value, and actually apply that to the entire image sequence. There could be other ways to do that faster, but this is one way we can do right now. Let's store a copy of this image too, just in case we need to get back to that a little bit faster. So what I'll do is I'll wait for the entire image sequence to be done, and it's coming up soon. There it is. So now I can go and store an image copy. There it is. Alright, so here we have the image copy that represents the brick elevation, the higher up elevation map. Now maybe there is too much bumpiness to that, right? Maybe you want to adjust that a little bit. That's a good thing to know how to do. Go to the adjust and use the curves tool. Now you could use levels or contrast value. You could adjust the contrast. I like the curves. That one is really intuitive. You want to say plateau or flatten up the tops and level down the valleys, right? So you can kind of do a little S shape there. Not too much, just a little bit. And that will allow you to perhaps have less disturbance on that elevation map along the tops of the bricks, and also in the valleys of the mortar, just in case you had too much initially. So animate that again across the entire animation. And so now we have 150 frames that are ready to be rendered in Puppy Ray. Or are they? Well, yeah, pretty much. It still looks like it's somewhat tileable. It should be seamless. If you needed to, you could turn this into a seamless texture in a couple of ways. That's really subject for a different tutorial though. So I'm going to go and take this into Puppy Ray now. That's under the filters, transforms, Puppy Ray. There it is. And there is a CPU version that's a little bit slower. So I like to just demonstrate that on the GPU. But keep in mind that the GPU might be less safe if your GPU is not very high-end, or if it's just not able to render it in time, and Windows says, well, something seems to be hung or stuck or not recorded, not happening anymore. So Windows might actually say, let's reset this driver for the graphics card if the GPU is stuck in something that takes too long. I don't know what the threshold is. It might be a second or two or something. So what I'll do is I'll go into the GPU, and my initial view here is of course a bit disturbing, a little bit confusing, but I do have my brick elevation map here. I can reduce the altitude. Let's go to scale the world down a little bit. Bring it down. Don't overshoot, that will go the other way, but let's go a bit like this. There you go. And so the nice thing about it is I can also enable the global illumination that brings up a little bit light here from the sky. The global illumination is basically using the sky, and we can see the sky right up here. Looking up, there's actually a nice little pattern of clouds. There are 2 or 3 predefined skies. If you like a sunset reddish coloring to occur, you can do that here. So there is a sunset that we have here. And then we can also use just a sort of a moon with starry night, that kind of scenario. Maybe you want it just plain white. Again, that's a common theme. Keep it simple, make it just go to a single color. Let's say that color needs to be white, and we don't have it here yet. We have black here, so we could actually use that, or, well, we just need to invert it. Let's go back out, done, undo, and take a look. Where does that color, the sky, actually come from? We have the main image here for the elevation. The swap image contains the coloring. Well, we do have one more image, and that's the custom brush. So you can actually use the custom brush to produce the sky. What's in the custom brush right now? Let's store it to see. Let's store and manage a copy of it. Oh, it's this funky little thing here, all black and transparent, and it just made the whole thing black. We could possibly invert that, or simply start from scratch. Really, probably safer to just say, let's go and make this whole thing white. Let's pick it up as a custom brush. Actually, the whole image, why not? It could be just a portion of it too. We could go with the custom brush selector right here, say pick this thing up. Doesn't have to be exactly square, but we can store this as a custom brush. Well, it's got the transparency also, because that is the background color, so it saw these pixels as the same as the background color or the secondary color, so it says, well, let's keep them transparent. If you don't want that, you can right click on the custom brush selector tool in order to adjust the amount of transparency you have on the alpha here. So let's keep it like this and store that one as an image. So now that one is opaque. This one we don't need anymore. We have a stored brush that's simply a plain white image. Let's go back on our image we had here with the brick, and so now we can go back into the ray tracer, Puppy Ray. So let's go minimize this one. We probably don't really need this as a paintbrush. I mean, that's what this is a custom brush we can use for painting if we wanted to, right? We could use this and just paint with that, but that's not what we want to use it for. That's undo, and what we want to use it for is the sky. So we can go to transform, Puppy Ray, GPU, and we need to make sure we use that sky now. So now under the skies, where is it? There, skies, we have this one, the fourth one, defined by the custom brush, and it is white. So if we have the global illumination, it's going to be mostly a whitish color. If we use the view controls here, we can see the plain white sky, but we still have a little bit of a fog that's kind of a bluish tint. That's this one here, this fog color. So let's go adjust that. In fact, let's take a look at all of these parameters. We have the fog. Let's go and make it just plain white, like this, and that will make the fog, you know, disappear to white as well. We can now adjust the level of the fog. How far is it? Puppy Ray will tile this image endlessly, so as long as it needs, until the fog is dense enough that it hides the tiles. So that's the nice thing about it, is that you can make your brick wall now very big. You can make it endless, right? You can go like this, right click to rotate, left click to spin around like this, and make it go really far away. And you might still want to do some additional additional fog transition. And maybe it's a little bit too sudden here. When you look at this here, say, well, that's I'd like it to fade more progressive, more softly. So you could still do that too. One thing I'll do, oh, and we see the seam here, so it was not a totally seamless texture after all, but that's okay. It's kind of cute there. So what I'll do is I'll adjust the position a little bit to be in a more consistent place. Let's see if we move through that. Are we seeing any sort of seams? No, it's not too bad. We can move it either by moving the camera or by moving the terrain itself, right? This is a terrain elevation map, so we can adjust the position of the terrain, or we can adjust the camera over that terrain. Now, it might look like exactly the same thing, but it's actually changing the position of the camera. As you can see here, it gets it closer or farther away from the light. There is a light source too, so the light can be moved around, and that light source, if you just move the terrain, it doesn't make it brighter or lighter. So that means you can keep it a bit more consistent. You can also bring it up with the right button here. You can bring it up so it's a very low or very high light source, and that will of course increase the quality or the depth perception with the shadows. So let's see if we can add a little bit more on the depth here. Now here we actually see where the light source is. So with the light source, we can say, let's bring it close enough to the far end, and then bring it up higher with the right button. I'm moving it up. That is no good if you want long shadows. So you want to have somewhere in between, and then you perhaps want to add the depth a little bit more, just so like this, or maybe just have the intensity of the light such that it's not giving you too much of a bright spot there. So let's give it like this. Now we have perhaps some viewing controls to adjust a little bit. You know, which way do we want to actually see it, at what angle, something like that. Is that about the orientation you want? Now we can also adjust the depth, the extrusion depth here, right? We use the grayscale image as an elevation map, but the amount of extrusion here, based on that, can be adjusted. So let's say we want to actually have it now. That's where I'm talking about the animation. Let's do a quick final render. And again, this is where if you have a slow GPU or something's wrong with it, it might not really do what you want it to do. So be safe and save often. You know, you can always get out of this and then get back into it, but make sure you save those images that you may want to use again. And so I'm going to go and undo this and go right back in, transform PuppyRay. It still remembers the current parameters. That rendering, it takes a little bit longer the first time because it's actually doing that using the same settings I had at the end. Last time I rendered it was final render. I may want to change that while I'm still working on the medium quality here. And so one thing I want to do is do a little animation where perhaps the shadow, the light is changing, so that I get a little bit more or a little bit less of the ambient light, but also a little bit more or less on the lighting and the shadows in particular coming from the light source. So I want to have a bit of a long lighting effect like this. And then the movement is not going to be done by moving the camera, right? If I move the camera, I might go into that light source. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want to simply make it look like this brick wall is moving past me, but the light source stays in the back there. So the way to do that is to actually move the world rather than moving the camera. This one here moves the camera. This one here moves the world. And when you do that, you can, you know, it's moving pretty quickly there. There you go. All right, so what we'll do is we'll move it from one end to the other across that spectrum. So, and we may even want to rotate it a little bit. Right, that's actually a interesting animation to do too. If you use the rotation, rotate the camera, you can, you know, maybe do something like this here, where you have it on this side, and then you by the end of the animation, you may want to look down the other way, right, this way. So you could do an animation like this. Let's see what the light source might look best at. If I adjust the position, there you go. We got some lighting. We see the shading here, and that's a good shadow to have. Now, if we want to really exaggerate it, we can get the scale up here, and we see these bricks coming like teeth coming to us here. So there's some really fun animations we can do with that, and it really takes it beyond just doing a brick. You also see it a bit squeezed here. Maybe we want to adjust the width of that, so we scale it in one direction. You see the scale here of the world. We can scale it, flatten it, make it a little bit more elongated bricks, that sort of thing. All right, so let's store it at this one. Actually, no, let's change the angle even a bit more, something like this, and then look up. There you go. I think we're almost there. Not totally. I want to rotate. I want to look at that particular angle, side there. Something like that. Bring it up, bring it up, bring it up. Yeah, there you go. So now I have the initial angle. Let's go save that, create a key, and then I'm going to go to the end of my animation, where I want to obviously have it look at the other side and go to infinity over there. Right? And you could even change the amount of fog. You know, have it very close up first, and then have it further away. I'll leave you to play with that. So let's go with something like that, and see if we want to do a little bit more. We could go like this. What do we like? Let's give it like this. Okay, and there you go. So now we have keyframed the beginning and the end. Here's the beginning. Here's the end of the brick wall. And we might want to make it a little bit more realistic, showing a bit more of the texture there. That's something you can adjust the pre-filter here to show more detail, or you can flatten it or smooth it with the pre-filter, so it will look much more eroded, soft. Maybe the default is a good place to be. And so now it's just a matter of setting the quality, high quality, or final render, or even beyond that. You can go to final, and even beyond that. Again, if your GPU is fast enough, if you trust it will be able to do that without timing out, you might even try that. Here's what I'll do. I'll save it. I'll keep it as a medium quality, but then I'll actually go and render. When I render this, I'll go and render that at final, and just go and do that. So now it's doing the rendering of, what did we say, about 150 frames or so, and I'll pause the recording and get back when we're almost done, and then we can see the final result. Alright, just a few more frames and this is done. Alright, so let's take a look at this animation. Let's play it at 30 frames a second. Oh, let's play it at full size. This is not currently full size. There you go. And we'll put that at the end of this recording. So anyway, so here's a way to create a somewhat realistic brick wall. Of course, there's many other ways, and there's a lot of other things you would want to see on a brick wall to make it even more realistic, right? You might want to have some shrubbery or grass or moss or something else growing on that, and that's something you could either incorporate in the color map before you render it into 3D, but that might not be 3D-ish for the foliage. You might want to add the foliage later on, so that's something you can do with the brushes to paint over that, right? For instance, one thing about doing this in animation is that sometimes you don't quite know which angle you like the best, which orientation. So rather than doing one rendering, do a whole bunch. A little animation allows you to change the camera or change the position, the light source, and other things, and eventually you'll find one that's just right, just perfect. And let's say it's this one, right? So let's store this one. Let's go and store the animation. We probably don't need it anymore, but let's go store this to disk, and we might easily get back to it that way. This just takes a few seconds because I have a slow hard drive. There you go. It's a good idea to defrag it every once in a while. But so right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that image that I stored here, this one, I'm going to free the animation, don't need it as an animation anymore. And we can see we still have that original brick coloring on the swap image. Here we have the actual 3D rendered version. And what I'd like to do is add a little bit of foliage brushes to that, just to give you an idea of a couple of things you can do. First of all, just like we did earlier, we can go to the linear gradient tool here and apply the gradient, and it's still in multiply mode. So that's one way that you can to say, for instance, you want the transition to be a little bit softer or more subtle. Maybe start over here, and if you need to, you can adjust that gradient itself too. So you can go to Window Sweep Editor, that's our gradient sweep editor, and you can work either on the value and keep it black or dark a little bit longer. I do something like this, so it only gradually adds that whiteness to it. Or you can do that through the opacity. Right now the opacity is full everywhere here, but you could also make that kind of a transition as well. So lots of different ways to adjust, maybe smooth it a little bit, and adjust the swiftness, or how quickly or how suddenly or how progressively this transition happens. Right. So let's go and bring the original back in there and see, for instance, if we do something like that, we have somewhat control of this. We can also add, same tool here, right click on that, you'll see the nova or the lens flares. I love the lens flares. Photographers hate it because that's the reality, they try to avoid them. But in CG, in computer graphics, it's always fun to add simulated lens flare and reflections and that sort of things. Let's say we put it out here a little bit, and it just adds a tiny little hint of reflection there. Maybe that's the final thing to do at the very end. One thing we can do though also is, like I said, is to add some foliage to this, add a little bit of moss or grass. And so I'll finish by showing that using the brush tool. There is a collection of brushes called the particles, and the particle brushes, I'm going to pin this down, there are the original particles, bristles, foliage. Let's stay with the particles there. One thing you want to do is actually use this image as a guide. We call that a force field. Right, so right over here there is the force field. It used to be FF. You can just click on force field and it will grab the image and then start using that for your particles. So let's take a look at that. And the force field is fairly weak initially, but if you start painting with this, and we need to enable it actually, there you go. So now let's go undo this. There, now the force field is present, but it's not very strong yet. Let's go and make it a little bit stronger, increase the power there. Now you see that these particles are kind of affected by the brick walls, right, by the contrast from that brick wall. You can adjust in a couple of different ways, and you can also adjust the type of force field based on the slope, based on hue, based on value, and the effect will be very different. So adjust those until you find a good way to make the particles. Let me see, is that the one? That's not the one. Let's just undo that and make sure we store a copy of this, because I have a feeling we'll go back to that a few times. There you go. So we have now the settings so that we can kind of paint along the grooves, and it kind of it stays in there. It branches out a little bit, but it's a way to kind of create the appearance of something is growing over that and respecting the shapes, going into the grooves there. So how do we actually make it look like moss? Well, the trick now is, now that we have that force field, we can continue to focus on those particles and actually use some presets. Let's go load preset for grass, genie, garland. Garland might be promising here. Yep. That's an interesting one. Now maybe it's too intense. Maybe we want just a little hint of moss. Let's see if there's one actually called moss. I think we have some. Maybe not here, but there are some additional ones you can download. If you don't see them right here, there's seaweed, right? Sometimes the nice thing is to actually bring the two together, do a little bit of dark ones, a little bit of light ones, but most importantly also work with the parameters itself here. You see it's a line or it's a shrinking line. The shrinking line will make it thinner, and then you can actually adjust how much to thin it. You can say start really small already, set the size here really small, or you can say let's make it really fat, like big vine, right? Stuff like that. And then there is also, let's give it a little bit of, make it really thin, like hairy. I want to make it look like hairy, so we need to give it some randomness to it. There's a randomized by value. Let's give it about 2 or 3, and then work with the power so that it's not too much power, just a little bit of freedom to grow all over the place there too. So you can see how now it's starting to look like a little bit of a growth is going over that brick wall as well. And so in the end, that's perhaps another level of visual realism. It's not so much the brick itself, it's what else you do to it to give it, what was it, lichen or something like that. There's some lichen we can add to that. Let's make that also shrinking lines. It already is. Let's make it thinner. Let's give it a little bit more longevity, or the lifespan. Let's give it 22. And so that allows it to grow into those grooves a little bit deeper and longer. Sometimes you want it to follow the mouse. Give it the mouse velocity, follow the mouse, so it kind of allows you to guide it more. The force field has its say, but you also have your ideas about where to go, so you can do that. You can also, let's see if there's some more. There's weeds, a couple of weeds, weird eyelashes. There's some really interesting settings here. Batty grass, like that one, but that's more for grass. Let's see, let's do one more. Fanciful dog willow. I think dog willow is pretty good. Let's do that. Yeah, so let's reduce the impact of the force field a little bit. Let's go back to the original image and just add that, but we want it more greenish. So to do that, Let's keep the gradient here. Let's make it shrinking line. Let's give it relatively thin. Let's give it a lot of randomness, randomized by this about 4 times. And so now let's zoom in just to see what's happening with that. It's just following that force field quite nicely. Not too much, just a little bit. And so with that, I think I'm pretty much done. I'm gonna go and just see if I can give it a bit more gain here. And hold on a second. And let's see, that's a little bit brighter. Yeah, much better. And in fact, the gradient itself we can change too here. We could say, no, let's keep it brighter all over. A little bit more green. Increase the green here. A little bit less blue. A little bit more reddish, right? Because we have the brick wall. Maybe we want to make it affect the coloring on the greens as well, on the foliage. And so we get some of that. Maybe it's too bright. Let's reduce the gain. Maybe we do need a little bit more softness, a very thin, a very low size, and then also have it actually on the particle, on the coloring, on the gradient, make it more transparent. See something like this here, right? So it's not really applying this. It's kind of like, what's the right word for it? It's not going to be a very solid appearance for that material. It's kind of very fluffy, you know, like mold. And we can give it a little bit of this, a little bit of the force field, and so now it's just like starting to look pretty good. Let's clear it and start all over here with a little bit of force field affecting where that mold or where that moss is going to grow. And you see now it's, oh, I went too far here. Let's go and undo that. But what you can see is that you can give it a little bit of noise. You can give it a little bit of interesting thing to add to it, right? That's what it's often about when you add some realism, is you give it something to distract the eye. You give it something to make it look like, that doesn't belong here. And just by doing so, it looks a little bit more natural, because a lot of things don't belong where they are. Let's see what else we have. Garland 2. That one's too intense. You know what, let me go back to the regular force field. I think that's the one I was missing. Yeah, so I'm gonna go and set the size, shrinking lines very thin, and force field a little bit stronger, but also a higher, let's say no gravity or barely any gravity, but a lot more, oh wait, that's a zero, a negative. Let's give it 0 gravity, but let's give it also a little bit more velocity. Or less maybe, yeah, a little bit less. There you go. So now if we have it, let's see, splits, lifespan, a little bit longer. That's very short. So now we could perhaps give it a little bit more force. And you see, you know, some ways to make it go. Maybe if we give it negative gravity, actually it will start to look like it's growing upwards. So let's say minus 0.3. Not a lot of that, just a little bit. So anyway, you see there's a lot more you can do to add to that visual realism, and to kind of follow some of it, but let the force field help you, right? I mean, you can manually paint roughly along these grooves, but then you can have the force field also help you and guide it somewhat along that to make it look like, no, that's what it chooses, where to grow. And how it's doing that. Now, one thing to remember also when you paint with particle brushes, sometimes you want to have it fade away and not just end suddenly. What you can do is use a shift key to stop generating new particles. So as you have a high particle count here, particles per emission might be even higher, 22, something like that. And you might have a long lifespan here. Let's do 22. So they grow all over the place. And one thing you may say is, okay, I want to stop, but you don't want to stop right away, because if you stop suddenly, you may have the trunk of it cut off, and it looks odd. It looks like maybe it's a dark spot, a bright spot. And a cleaner way to do that is to just end it softly by waiting for the particles to end until they reach the end of their lifespan and not regenerate them, right? You do that by holding the shift key down while painting. Look at that, I'm painting and I'm holding the shift key right now. It still paints for a few, like another 1 or 2 seconds. Let me make it even longer. Let me make the lifespan really long, like 66 or something like that. So you see these particles going on forever and ever. If I hold the shift key now, boom, it still went for another 2 or 3 seconds, right? So that's the idea, is that you can adjust, you can keep painting, and then when you know you're getting ready to stop it, you don't have to stop right away. Okay, so let's just hold the shift key down. So let's paint a little while, and when you're ready to stop, you say shift key. Boom, now. Okay, so then that's a nice and even gradual progression where it stops painting. Any particle that has already launched will continue to the end of its lifespan, and then but no new ones will be generated, right? Because if you press the shift key down and start painting, nothing is happening. No new ones are being generated. But if you don't press the shift key down and you start painting, here they come. Now press the shift key. A few more get to finish their lifespan, and that's it. Then you can let go of the mouse and the shift key. Alright, so thanks for watching. This turned out to be a much longer tutorial once again, but I mean, hey, ask for it, right? You want to see something realistic, that's where it starts. This is not it yet. Obviously, you can always add some more photographic filters, contrast improvement. Look at that, so different in appearance just by adding a little bit of that. Maybe you want to add a little bit of light diffusion is a good one also, especially when you have a lot of bright light there. Add a little bit of light diffusion to that, or dark diffusion. Let's also finalize this with a little bit of a mystic vision there. The blur has a mystic vision, and you can make it look like there's a really bright light source down there somewhere that's kind of shining on it, right? Something like that. High factor, high quality. You don't want the quality low. Let's give it high quality, and then also have the level reduced. You don't want it blurring it out altogether. Just a little tone to that. There you go. All right, so that's that for now, and thanks for watching.